you trust your partner in business, whether it's your co-founder or a lateral hire or a hired executive if you are a shareholder or a passive investor? How can you be sure that he or she doesn't cheat on you? You might think that this is a question of ethics and integrity, or how well you know that person and his or her record and background. But I want to give you another angle to this question. The answer to it depends to a large extent on how your interests are aligned. I want to talk about the corrosive effect of what is known as conflict of interest and what can be done about it. Because in business, like in politics, the conduct of humans is driven by interest and self-interest more than by any personal qualities such as honesty and integrity. Just the way it is, and there is very little you can do about it. I would like to demonstrate to you how pervasive the problem of conflict of interest is in business, and refute some rather common opinions about the importance of trust in business and the ways to deal with it. Whenever your business partner or executive director acts in a way that is difficult to explain or understand based on a simple business logic, it might be the case that his or her action is driven by an ulterior motive attributable to a conflict of interest, of which you're not aware. This is when you should start asking questions, or else your trust in your business partner may be undermined or even completely destroyed, even if he or she is innocent. Watch this video to the end if you want to understand how to deal with such situations and how to protect yourself and your business against the corrosive effect of conflict of interest. Now, you can navigate this video by using the map that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen and jump to the parts that you are interested in. However, I strongly recommend that you watch all the parts of the video sequentially, lest you will miss some elements which are important for understanding what it's all about, because this is a very tricky subject. Although I'll be talking about the impact of the conflict of interest in business, let me start with a very real example from the world of politics that most of you, particularly those in the UK, will be familiar with. I'm talking here, of course, about so-called Jeffrey Epstein files. Events that happened years ago, over 15 years ago, but the details of which only emerged recently, nearly caused the downfall of the British Prime Minister, as well as the unprecedented arrest of the younger brother of the reigning British monarch. There was, of course, too much noise about this whole thing, and some of you might be tired of it. Yet, I want to focus on the aspect of the story that didn't get the attention that it deserved, with much of the focus being on the alleged breach of rules applicable to government figures and civil servants. For me, it's much more important and relevant, far beyond the framework of government. It's about conflict of interest more generally. While the Brits would be familiar with the facts, let me remind them briefly for the audience outside of the UK. It recently came to light that Lord Mendelssohn, while he was business secretary in Gordon Brown's government in 2009-2010, apparently, I'm being careful here because there is an ongoing investigation to this matter and these allegations have not been officially confirmed, shared some very sensitive information he had access to with Jeffrey Epstein. Although there are records of some payment by the latter to Mendelssohn, it's pointless to speculate at this point what his actual motives were, if the fact of leakage proves true. All we can infer from the publicly known facts is that his actions as a government minister were driven by some personal interest unrelated to his official duties. So we have here two key ingredients of a conflict of interest problem. A person in a position of power or privileged access to highly sensitive information having some extraneous interests affecting the use of power or privileged access. I will show how these two elements interact with other elements to create a rather explosive mixture. Now, whatever results the current investigation will have in terms of his culpability for breach of his duties as a government minister, it's unlikely to prove any specific material damage caused to the UK back in 2009-2010. Indeed, while he may have done a favor to his late friend Epstein, any tangible damage to the UK will be very hard to prove, particularly so many years after the event. Now, pausing for a few minutes the discussion of the Epstein-Mendelssohn case, let's go back to the main title of this video and see how the above-mentioned elements of conflict of interest play out in a business context. I shall do so by telling you a real-life story that I was personally involved in as a legal consultant a few years ago. For reasons of confidentiality, I will not name the clients, nor will I provide any details that may help identify it. I would just say that this is a very large FMCG company operating throughout the world and selling very famous brands. So let's call it Famous Brands Incorporated, or FBI for brevity. A few years ago, my client acquired a significant minority stake in its national distributor in one of its key markets, which also distributed products of some of its competitors. Let's call it a Tremendous Logistics Incorporated, or LTI. Thus, my client became a direct shareholder of its own distributor, sending directors to its supervisory board. It's quite a normal business transaction so far, but there was a snag. The majority owners of TLI, the distributor, also owned one of the largest retail chains in this country, selling, among other things, my client's products. Moreover, one of them was also the CEO of the distributor, which my client FBI, as a minority shareholder, could not remove, nor did they want to, as I will explain a bit later. So we've got here the same two key elements of conflict of interest that I flagged earlier in relation to Mendelssohn's case. Persons in a position of power and or access to commercially sensitive information with extraneous interests capable of affecting their use of power or access. Like in Mendelssohn's case, there were other stakeholders whose interests could be affected by their use of power. In this case, this was not public or taxpayers, but minority shareholders, including my client, Famous Brands Incorporated. Without going into much detail of this very long saga, I would just say that my client took a rather dim view of the situation. They believe, with good reasons, that this could have a detrimental effect on the business of TLI, but could also damage their interest as an upstream customer by providing advantages to one of its key downstream customers. I will not go into much detail as to how, because this would be a very long digression. So FBI raised this issue quite persistently, with TLI demanding that some action be taken to address it. The majority owners of TLI obviously denied any wrongdoings, just like Mr. Mendelssohn now. Indeed, there was no hard evidence that any potential conflict of interest has actually translated into any tangible damage for either TLI's shareholders or its upstream customers like ABI, which were of course the same parties. Nevertheless, my clients insisted on an audit which was carried out by a Big Four accounting firm at a considerable expense to TLI. It did not uncover any major problem, although it did point to some potential problems and issues and propose some remedial action. In terms of immediate financial impact, I think that the cost of the audit was probably more material than any damage attributable to conflict of interest that was uncovered through the audit. This is the third element of conflict of interest that I hinted to earlier in relation to Mendelssohn's case: a diffuse nature of possible damage, making it very difficult to detect and measure it. In this case, a very deliberate attempt to do so was made with very meager results. So when the protagonist can secure a tangible benefit for himself or his related parties, friends, relatives, etc., where the damage to the others, whose interests he is in theory supposed to look after, is so diffuse and imperceptible that it's very unlikely to ever be noticed, the temptation is quite strong. In Mendelssohn's case, or that of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, they could hardly have imagined that their private correspondence with Jeffrey Epstein would ever come to light. Why would they expect it? There was no reason whatsoever. Nobody could foresee in 2009-2010 the possibility and scale of the Epstein scandal involving the publication of all his files. There is no doubt, to my mind, that they would never have done what they did, if indeed they did it, if they had any premonition of what was coming years later. Switching back to FBI's case, ultimately some procedural measures were designed and implemented by us in order to exclude or minimize the impact of conflict of interest on TLI's business, including strengthening internal control procedures. Among other things, this included the ban on the combination of positions for TLI's executives, subject to a possible waiver, which was duly granted to the CEO of the company. I shall dwell a bit later on the measures that could be introduced to address the conflict of interest problem in a business based on this precedent. But now I want to emphasize one further point, and this is in fact the fourth key element of the conflict of interest problem. The protagonists of the story, the majority owners and the CEO of the distributor, not only strongly denied any wrongdoings, but seemed to be even offended by the mere suspicion thereof. After all, had they not built this very successful and profitable distribution business, making them one of the leading FMCG distributors in the country, which is why my client invested in it? Have there been any grievances or complaints about the way they run the business? In fact, they seem to sincerely believe that their record of management was completely unimpeachable. Was it indeed? Well, I cannot say with certainty, but the fact is that my client never really sought the removal of the CEO because of his conflict of interest, even though it would have been the most effective way of resolving it. On balance, I think they agreed that the benefits of keeping him as the CEO, given all his skills and experience, outweighed the risks posed by his conflict of interest. Now, in case of Mendelssohn, wasn't he credited with the great services that he rendered to the Labour Party and the Labour government? Indeed, he is sometimes referred to as one of the main architects of the New Labour and its success. So he might be justified in thinking that they outweighed by far whatever damage he could have caused by leaking information to Epstein, even if it was ever proven. The important factor in this case was that neither the facts nor the nature of his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein was known at the time when he was a minister in Gordon Brown's government. This fact surfaced only years later and quite unexpectedly, as I mentioned a bit earlier. And this is a much more common situation in real life than transparency of interest. Because what I call extraneous interest may take such diverse shapes and forms that it's very difficult to pinpoint them, let alone assess their impact on the stakeholders' performance. Because conflict of interest can take so many forms, full disclosure of all relevant extraneous interest might be difficult to achieve. This is because any definition of conflict of interest is likely either to be incomplete or allow sufficient room for interpretation, providing what is known as plausible deniability to the persons required to disclose it. In other words, the relevant parties might be able to claim that they either didn't think there was a conflict of interest to disclose or that they forgot about it. After all, talking about key executives, they are very unlikely to be fired or heavily penalized only because they forgot to disclose a particular conflict of interest, at least if they're very good at what they do otherwise. It is true that probably all public companies and large corporations, as well as public authorities, have mandatory rules on disclosure of conflict of interest. The distributor I talked about earlier certainly did. How well they are complied with is another matter. But when it comes to small businesses, very few of them have any such rules. There are, of course, some statutory rules, at least in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and some other countries, applicable to partnerships and company directors and addressing the problem of conflict of interest. But they're usually rather generic in nature, and some business people may not even be aware of them, particularly if they don't have a legal department to advise them on them. One could say that these rules are much less important in small businesses because, unlike in large companies, people or partners know each other much better, and it's more difficult to conceal or disguise a possible conflict of interest. That might be partly true, but it doesn't mean that conflict of interest is a lesser concern. So, how can you effectively protect yourself and your business against the corrosive effect of conflict of interest and be able to trust your business partners? Before we move any further, let me summarize what is meant by conflict of interest. Put in very simple terms, conflict of interest refers to situations where a stakeholder's ability to make reasonable and optimal decisions for the business is compromised by an extraneous interest that he or she has elsewhere. This may only happen if the extraneous interest in question is relevant in some way to the business in question. Stakeholder may be anyone with the power to take decisions on behalf of the business or create liabilities for it, such as an executive director, a general partner, etc. In other words, a decision maker. Although we've seen that a conflict of interest may entail damage for a business without any decision being made on behalf of the business, for example, by leaking confidential information to third parties. For example, if the stakeholder has a financial interest in the other party to the transaction with the business, he or she may agree terms which are more advantageous to the other party than they would have been otherwise, because he or she can personally benefit from them. In fact, it doesn't have to be him or herself. It may be his close relatives or friends. Here comes in Jeffrey Epstein, or even a lover or mistress, which makes it even more difficult to detect. But this is just a very basic and obvious example of conflict of interest. In fact, the range of extraneous interests that can affect the stakeholders' conduct is much broader and much more difficult to pinpoint. I'll give you another example, again from the world of politics. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, whose second and last term in office expires in slightly more than a year, was recently reported to take a more pro EU position on certain key foreign policy issues than in the past. The reason alleged for this in the press was that it gives him a better position to try and secure a key EU appointment once his term as president is over. He's still quite young for a politician, less than 50 years, and very ambitious. So he's unlikely to enjoy a quiet retirement while there is no chance for him to take another key political position in France comparable to his current position. Is this allegation true? Well, we probably will never know what Macron thinks, but I think this is a very plausible hypothesis. It is a conflict of interest in the sense that his personal interest or ambition overrides the interest of France that he must look after as the president. While considering the very broad discretion that he enjoys as president in matters of foreign policy, this can only be established if there is evidence that he acted against and not in the best interest of France, specifically because he wanted to ingratiate himself with the EU with the objective of securing himself a position there. I'm sure this will never be established, even if he ends up getting such a position. Like in the case of a CEO, he can always argue that what he was doing was the best course of action for the stakeholders, in this case the French state, and he might be right, even if he was also driven by an ulterior motive, which we will never know. Nor can this hypothesis be definitively refuted if he ends up going into business where he had come from, rather than the EU. So it will probably forever remain just a plausible hypothesis, no more. In other words, it's next to impossible to draw an exhaustive list of all extraneous interests that may negatively affect the stakeholders' performance. Now, how different is conflict of interest from corruption? I would say that corruption or bribery is just a variation of conflict of interest. Money or any other value that a stakeholder receives from a third party to cause a particular outcome is just a kind of extraneous interest affecting the stakeholder's actions. For example, the $75,000 that Mendelssohn apparently received from Epstein, according to the published correspondence between them, was it a bribe? Well, the investigation will hopefully show. The key difference is that in case of corruption, there is a clear link between the bribe, i.e., something of value provided to the stakeholder, and specific action taken by the stakeholder, because a bribe is usually provided for a specific purpose. Once you have established this, there is nothing else to prove. No good faith or reasonable judgment defense is available. It's just a crime or at least a misdemeanor. In other cases of conflict of interest where there is no such obvious and specific incentive, it's usually much more difficult to link the stakeholder's action to an extraneous interest unless he or she acts clearly unreasonably, so that this is the only reasonable explanation for his or her acts. Without any objective or outer indicators, as in the case of a bribe, it's all down to subjective and mental processes within the stakeholder's head, which are extremely difficult to elicit unless he spells them out himself. But why would he do that? And if he does, can you take his word at face value? So it must be clear by now that it's very difficult to assess with any degree of accuracy the extent to which such extraneous interest affects the performance of the person who has a conflict of interest. Basically, it's the relative weight of his or her interest as a stakeholder in the business, whether it is his or her share of profits or remuneration, including the performance-based part of it, against his or her interest in the other party, or whatever else conflicting interest he or she may have. Yes, you can try to put some numerical values to them, assuming you have all the relevant information, which is not at all a given. But even if you do, you cannot really do this balancing assessment in the place of the person in question. It's really too subjective and individual, and there are too many variables and additional factors that you can't really properly assess. One of them is, in fact, attitude to risk, which is very individual. I'll come to this in a few minutes. Considering all this as well as the cost of monitoring, the only effective solution to conflict of interest is its total elimination, which is the basic or default approach that we took in the case of my client mentioned earlier. If this is the right approach, it may be in some or many, but certainly not in all cases. Because the impact of conflict of interest is particularly strong for key decision makers, those who usually have a rather high degree of autonomy in making decisions on behalf of the business. If a stakeholder has no individual decision making authority, like minority shareholders, minor executives, or employees, his or her ability to cause damage to the business is very limited, but not completely excluded. For example, by leaking commercially sensitive information to third parties. For key decision makers, it may in practice be impossible to insist on them giving up their other interests because they would simply refuse to do so. The same in business partnerships. If you have a compelling business reason to go into a partnership with a particular person, you wouldn't normally balk at them having a conflict of interest or would have leverage to insist on them giving up their other interest. That was the case with the CEO of the distributor that I was talking about a few minutes ago. What further complicates matters is that such persons often have a big ego and a lot of confidence in their ability to make right decisions. That might be one of the main reasons why you need them in your business. They often believe, rightly or wrongly, that they can make right choices when it comes to situations involving a conflict of interest, and that their value for the business is much higher than any possible negative impact that the conflict of interest may have on their performance. Moreover, they sometimes confuse their own interests with those of the entity they are supposed to represent. Take Donald Trump as an extreme example of this phenomenon. This, I think, was the reason for a very defensive and angry reaction of the majority shareholder and the CEO of the distributor TLI I spoke about earlier to my client's request to sort out the conflict of interest problem. They were effectively in denial of any such problem at all and perceived it as an attempt to impugn both their integrity and competence. Were they overplaying their part? Well, it's quite possible. But the point is that my client was unable to overcome their resistance, and I think it was only partly due to their lack of leverage as a minority shareholder, but also largely to their unshakable self belief and confidence. This was the fourth element of the conflict of interest problem. Now let's move on to the fifth and last element. It's about risk appetite. I made a separate video on attitude to risk as a factor in people's life and business. The key point here is that people vary a lot in terms of their attitude to risk and how much risk they are prepared to take to achieve their objectives. I made the point that the majority of people, including myself, are rather risk averse, but this is the average person. The fact is that people who go into business or politics are not average people. Their main difference from the latter is that they're prepared to take more risks than the other people. This is explained in some part by their self-confidence, but also by the realization that there is no success without risk, either in business or in politics. So chances are that key players in business and politics are not as risk-averse as the rest of us. They have a part of gambling in them. In fact, part of the reasons of their success is they do not play by the rules. They are prepared to breach them and tear the playbook if necessary. Moreover, they are often annoyed by the rules, thinking that they are created for their subordinates, for the average person. So simply implementing rules on conflict of interest is unlikely to be effective with these people. They may not even think that ignoring those rules is a big risk, unless you make it really risky for them. In any case, it's usually much below the level of risk that they're prepared to take. The risks they are taking on behalf of the business are usually much higher. Now, let me ask you this question that you can answer to yourself. Assuming you are an average risk-averse person, if you were in a position to take decision on behalf of a business that would provide a personal sizable benefit to you personally, with rather limited impact on the business and with zero chance of this ever coming to light, would you do that? Well, let me tell you that as average as you may be in terms of your risk appetite, if you answered no to this question, you are not an average person at all. In fact, you are rather rare, if not unique. It means that you follow rules for the sake of following them, even if it's irrational in terms of your self interest. Anyway, I'm not trying to prove that you lack integrity. My point is that you should never assume that integrity and honesty are the predominant qualities of your business partner, overriding his or her self interest. Going back to Mendelssohn's case, he might have thought that the chances of his leaking government information to Epstein ever being revealed were, if not zero, very close to zero. And remember that he's a politician, i.e., he belongs to the species of people who are usually much less risk averse than the average people like you and me. So, what is the solution to the problem of conflict of interest? Is the only option to give up and to accept this as inevitable evil or a lesser evil? Of course not. But you have to accept that the total elimination of conflict of interest may not be achievable or its cost may be prohibitive. Still, there are a few strategies that you could deploy to mitigate the risks associated with conflict of interest. First, the rules. I suggested that they may not be very effective with certain kinds of people that usually fill leadership roles, but doesn't mean that they're useless. One of the key points is to make the breach of rules on conflict of interest so risky that even people with greater than average appetite for risk will think twice before breaching them. There is no simple and magic solution to the conflict of interest problem. If you want to tackle it effectively, you need to have a whole strategy for this. While any such strategy is case specific, let me propose a general framework that can be easily adapted to your specific situation. I envision it as an ongoing and circular rather than linear process where the key elements are interlinked or interconnected as part of an integrated system. The first element is knowledge. It's about how and what you learn about your stakeholders' conflict of interest. Like the other elements of the process, it is not a one off but a continuous process. It has to be because things change over time and you cannot simply rely on what was disclosed to you at the entry point, although the initial disclosure is important. To make it as full and comprehensive as possible, we can provide you with a template disclosure sheet that addresses most of the concerns and flaws of the disclosure process that I mentioned earlier. The second element is risk assessment if a conflict of interest has been identified as a result of the disclosure process, or from other sources, as I will explain in a minute. For this, you should use the worst case scenario to determine the highest possible damage that the conflict of interest can cause to a business. So, for the sake of this exercise, you should assume the dishonesty of your partner for all the reasons that I have already explained. It's always a safe approach, even if he or she is clear as crystal. Third, based on your risk assessment, as per the previous step, you should consider if the full elimination of conflict of interest is the right approach here. As I explained earlier, this may not always be achievable or the cost may be too high. If so, you would want to impose strict rules to deal with the conflict of interest, which is step 5. Before you proceed to step 5, it's useful to do what I call risk mapping, i.e., identifying areas of high risk arising from the conflict of interest, such as the types of transactions that pose a high risk. For example, any transactions in which your stakeholder has a direct or indirect interest. Finally, the fifth element is what I call accountability. This means a close scrutiny of any transactions involving a conflict of interest, effectively placing a burden on the party with a conflict of interest to justify their terms. In other words, this means creating a presumption of breach of duty by the stakeholders with a conflict of interest, forcing them to refute it. Alternatively, you may recuse the stakeholders with a conflict of interest from decision making in such cases if it's feasible. It may not always be possible due to their special knowledge or expertise, legal constraints, or other factors. This, of course, relates to situations where the conflict of interest is known, for example, as a result of disclosure as part of step 1. If it's not, but the transaction in question seems odd or inconsistent with the usual normal practice, this may indicate the influence of an undisclosed conflict of interest. If so, this may warrant additional investigation or at least asking questions that may trigger the disclosure of an unknown conflict of interest, thus getting us back to step one. As I said, this is just the general framework for addressing the conflict of interest problem. You can use it as a basis for handling it yourself in your specific circumstances, or you may want to ask us to adapt this framework to your situation and design a bespoke solution for you, taking into account all the relevant factors. Whatever you decide to do, I hope that this video has been helpful and you do not regret having watched it. If you want to get more insight into this and other business-related problems, I invite you to join Ambrose Business Club, or ABC, by registering as a member using the link in the comment below. Thank you.